Hey everyone, and welcome to the section of our course where we're going to talk about class and poverty. We'll be using the book Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond, and this first week I'm going to talk about poverty measurement. So the official poverty measure was put in place back in the 1960s, and it was meant to be an interim standard. The author of the official poverty metric thought that it should be updated about every 10 years or so, and it's been instead 60 years, and we're still using that same metric. So it's based on the price of food in the 1960s, and it assumes that food is about 1/3 of family expenses. In reality, food's like closer to 1/10 of family expenses today because the cost of things like housing and healthcare have increased more quickly than the cost of food. But we still have this assumption because it really was like 1/3 of the average budget for lower income families back in the 60s. The only update you get is a general consumer price index update, and pretty much no one who studies it thinks that this is a good poverty metric, but there's no one owner for it. It's entrenched across multiple programs, and it's really hard to agree on what actually should be the metric. So, one that is produced and is used fairly widely by researchers is called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. It is produced by the Census Bureau. And what it does is the initial poverty measure is based just on income. This adds in benefits like SNAP for food stamps and WIC, Women, Infants, Children, which is another food-related program, the National School Lunch Program, housing subsidies. We've talked about those a little earlier, but like if you're getting a voucher for housing, that is basically an income benefit that reduces how much you pay for housing. So this should count in terms of your resources. There's a program called the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which provides money for utility bills. And then taxes are actually a big place here. And by that I mean tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit contribute quite a bit to bringing people above the poverty line. And they're not necessarily counted if they're refundable credits, right? And then you subtract from family resources taxes, work expenses, childcare expenses, medical out-of-pocket expenses, and child support. So this is a big improvement. It has some issues that I'm going to get into. And it's also not something that is used, though, to determine like eligibility for these programs. The programs still use the official poverty measure. But the reason I really wanted to point this out right at the beginning is there's a place in the book where he argues that we haven't really made much of an impact on poverty. And I think, in the general spirit of like, we could have done more. Yes, I think many of the things he points out in the book in terms of barriers to effectively fighting poverty are, right on. That's part of why I signed the book. But as a factual matter, the biggest reason that it looks like anti-poverty programs don't work is because we literally don't count them in the poverty metric, right? Like, if you give people vouchers for food and housing and then ask, did it make them less poor? Well, yeah, you can say no if your metric for measuring poverty doesn't count the vouchers for food and housing, right? Or for, does Medicaid make people less poor? Like, in some sense, it seems like it clearly makes people better off. They have access to medical services that they would not have had otherwise. They're less likely to go bankrupt from unexpected medical, right? Like, in general, it seems clear that there are things that are not money that make you better off. In particular, some of these benefits are very close. Like tax credits and SNAP are pretty close to being as fungible as money in some cases. All that to say, if you extend the supplemental poverty measure backwards in time to 1967, kickoff of the war on poverty, President Lyndon Johnson, you'd find that it actually did decrease poverty from about 25% at the time down to around 15%. And then it looks like there was a little progress, but you can also see things like you can see the recession of 2008 in the pre-tax and transfer data. And what happened there is there was a huge increase in expenditures on things like unemployment insurance, which is actually income, but also stuff like SNAP. And this helped to hold the poverty level after taxes and transfers to much less of an increase than the pre-tax and transfer one, right? So like this is an example of the safety net adapting to a massive recession that affected many people and mitigating that effect. And then the COVID reaction was so strong that the poverty rate had its biggest decline. And I mean, this shows up even in the official poverty metric because some of the COVID responses were in fact cash. In particular, child poverty was cut in half because of the expanded child tax credit. Unfortunately, that's been, allowed to expire, but it's fairly powerful to know that, like, yes, we could use these things. The programs themselves do work. He'll get to that a bit later in the book. Now, whether or not there are more efficient ways to do this, what's the best design, etc., there are plenty of good criticisms that he also makes of like ways that and some of these programs are administered in ways that are at times wasteful, and there are opportunities for efficiency. But I don't want people to read it and get the impression that like nothing has happened. Okay, so finally I want to talk about multidimensional poverty measurement. And this is the argument that what we care about when we talk about poverty is generally people's well-being. We should try to measure it directly. And the underlying idea comes from a pair of philosophers, and one of them is also an economist. It's called the capabilities approach, and it argues that we should measure the capabilities people have to live lives that are meaningful for them. And, the general idea here is instead of measuring resources that people have, or expenditures that they make, or relative positions in society, we measure things like, are they capable of healthy living? Do they have the resources they need that enable them to meet basic human capacities for flourishing, right? So consider, for example, the supplemental poverty metric only accounts for expenses on medical care. But that could go down either because healthcare gets covered by insurance or because people go without medical care. And those are very different, and we should care about the difference, right? We should care about the degree to which people have resources that allow them to live healthy lives. So multidimensional poverty metrics get a step closer to that. And, the UN Development Index is probably the best known example that attempts to combine multiple indicators into a single metric. But there are also more detailed ones used in a lot of international development work. But they haven't been used much in US poverty work, and there's only a handful of countries that have really explored them domestically. But we could make one. So from the American Community Survey, you could get individual level microdata. For health, you could get insurance. You could get self-reported disability in the form of difficulty taking care of yourself, overcrowded housing. You could get education indicators. Internet access is also one that I think is worth paying attention to. And part of this is the idea that like part of poverty is being able to interact with society on roughly equal terms. Not perfectly equal terms, but like having access to the things that allow you to live life as part of the society that you are in. Internet is now one of them, right? Linguistic isolation, and of course, your more traditional economic indicators. There's nothing about food in here because there's nothing in the American Community Survey. We could also, of course, if we were adopting a multidimensional poverty index, design a survey or add to an existing survey in order to better capture some of these ideas. And then aggregation is, there's multiple ways to aggregate, but one that actually works surprisingly well is to say, okay, I've got these 9 indicators. I'm going to make them binary indicators. If you are poor in 3 or more of these areas, or if you are, deprived in 3 or more of these areas, then you count as being in poverty on the multidimensional poverty index, right? This actually works surprisingly well for making these sort of incommensurable things commensurable, right? And this is an alternative approach to, say, converting everything into dollars, which is also possible and is like the approach the supplemental poverty measure takes. Okay. Matthew Desmond doesn't talk about multidimensional poverty, but one thing he does talk about is the idea that like poverty is not just this line, this income line. It's a tight knot of social maladies. It's connected to every social problem we care about: crime, health, education, housing. And its persistence in American life means that millions of families are denied safety and security and dignity in one of the richest nations in the history of the world. Right? So, again, I want to open up this notion that poverty is not just the official poverty measure and the income line. It's about multiple dimensions. And also, measuring it well matters in terms of policy evaluation. Like the initial point of the official poverty metric was to evaluate the war on poverty. Like that's why it came out in the 60s. So it was meant as a policy evaluation tool. But if you then don't count the things the policies are putting out, it's not a very good evaluation tool, right? So there's definitely a need to think very carefully about the data here and what we are actually saying and seeing when we look at poverty. Okay, looking forward to the discussion this week, as always. Thanks.